Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on floating on a Microsoft Cloud, Data Integration with Microsoft Cloud 101.
Hi, everyone. My name's Dara Broderick. I'm part of the FME desktop team here at Safe Software.
And I'm Jen. I'm an FME Cloud technology expert at Safe.
Awesome. Thanks both. And before we dive into things, welcome to Livestream if this is your first time in the platform. I do want to run us through a few different ways you can engage today. We have that React button in the middle, you'll see at the bottom there. Share your reactions with us throughout the webinar. We love to see them. We also have the questions tab. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, we will be keeping an eye on that. And you can also upvote other people's questions that are relevant to you. And then lastly, we have the chat. So yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from even now. We love to see where everyone's joining us from. And if you do have any issues with audio or video, click that help button on the bottom left, and there's 4 simple steps to troubleshoot. If you would like to follow along with the slide deck, you are welcome to download that now. Just click the apps button on the bottom right and then handouts, and you can download the deck from there. And as always, we will also send out the slides post-webinar in a follow-up email.
Our agenda for today includes an introduction to us here at Safe Software for any newcomers, an introduction to FME support for Microsoft's desktop formats, an insight into FME support for Microsoft's online formats such as SharePoint and OneDrive. We'll take a look at web connections and how to configure those web connections in FME. And we'll also use a web connection with the Microsoft Graph API. Then we'll tie all those points together into a Teams demo at the end. Okay, so before we kick off, we just have a poll here to see what Microsoft Office 365 products you use in FME most frequently.
Yeah, so a few different options there. And if you click on the poll tab on the bottom right, you can place your vote now. And we'll give everyone a few moments to complete that. All right, it looks like most people have their vote in now.
So I think a lot of you will find the content that we've prepared today very useful. And hopefully we'll be able to show you that connecting to Microsoft Office 365 products has never been easier with FME. A little bit more about us here at Safe Software for any newcomers to the webinar. We have been solving data challenges in the industry for over 28 years. We're trusted by over 16,000 organizations across 128 countries around the globe. And we have a wide-ranging partner support network, so you can be sure wherever you're based that you'll have someone there to support you. We also have a great community of users that has grown to over 20,000 members who are fantastic for sharing their knowledge on FME and helping each other out.
Awesome. And I think at this point, we can probably turn off our webcams just to save on some bandwidth for the rest of the webinar. And we'll see you guys on the other side for Q&A.
Okay, so we're working in the FME Enterprise Integration Platform, which includes FME Desktop, where you'll build your workflows, FME Server, which can be used to automate workflows that are created in FME Desktop, as well as utilizing powerful tools such as automations, schedules, and triggers. We have FME Cloud, which is FME Server, but it's hosted by us here at Safe Software. And then we also have FME Mobile, which can be used by workers in the field to trigger workflows. And that takes us into FME support for Microsoft Office products. So Safe has supported Microsoft Office products for a number of years. These formats, which I'm sure you're familiar with, include Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. So we currently support writing to Word documents for creation of reports and documentation, with the ability to stylize these documents using the Microsoft Word styler. For PowerPoint, this includes the creation of PowerPoint slides and presentations, along with the ability to customize these slides using the PowerPoint styler. And next to our most popular Microsoft Office product, which would be Excel. Our support for Excel includes reading and writing of Excel files, and FME's capabilities of Excel goes well beyond what I could try to cover in just a few sentences here. So I would recommend checking out some of the resources on utilizing your Excel data in FME, like a webinar on how you can improve your Excel data with FME, which we'll have a link to in the resources at the end.
Yeah, so in addition to the desktop Office formats that we support, we also support some of the cloud Office 365 formats as well. So we do have support in FME for SharePoint and OneDrive. So if you're working with OneDrive, you store your files in there, you can use the OneDrive connector to upload, list, download, or delete your files. And with SharePoint, we have a SharePoint list reader and writer and a SharePoint online connector. So there are differences between them. So the SharePoint list reader and writer basically does what it says. You can read in your SharePoint lists that are hosted on SharePoint server if you've got this on premise, or SharePoint online if you're using the cloud. So with the SharePoint list reader and writer, you can write, create, update, and delete items within your SharePoint lists, as well as create and delete the lists. But this is not intended to import files. So you can read in the metadata about the files, but you can't actually bring in the files that are hosted in SharePoint. If you want to do that, you'll probably need to use the SharePoint Online connector. So this allows you to upload, download, delete, or list the contents of files in your SharePoint Online service. So this is intended to import files. And both the SharePoint Online connector and the OneDrive connector, once you've downloaded the packages in Workbench so you can use these transformers, you have the ability to use file from web. So if you're reading in something like Excel or some other format, if that file is hosted on SharePoint or on OneDrive, you can do the drop down when you choose your dataset, choose file from web, and you can read those files directly from SharePoint or from OneDrive. If you want to use the OneDrive connector or you want to connect to SharePoint, you will need to set up a web connection. So a web connection is where you will enter in your user credentials. They'll get saved in FME, and they allow you to connect to a web service when you've already registered a service. So the web service is just a definition which you set up in FME, and which contains all of the information that is needed to connect to that service and how that service expects to authorize FME to use their application or their services. So within FME, we actually support a few different types of web connection or web service. So we support OAuth, token-based authentication, and HTTP. So for the Microsoft services that we're going to be looking at today, they use OAuth. So in FME, to configure your web service definition, you will need the following things. So you're definitely going to need your own client ID. You may need a tenant ID or a client secret, depending on your use case, which we'll cover in the next few slides and in the demo. You'll need a redirect URI, and you'll need to make sure that the web service that you're setting up has the right permissions to access what you're trying to access. And with the case of Microsoft, you'll set all of this up in the Azure portal. So let's go and take a look at how you can do that. So here we have on the left-hand side FME, and I'll show you how you can set up and configure your web service definition. And on the right-hand side, we have Azure portal open. So in FME, you need to bring up the FME options to be able to do this. And on the left-hand side, you can choose web connections, and then you can manage services by clicking on that button. So normally before you add a web connection, you may need to go and manage your services. So then on the left-hand side, you can see a list of the different services that FME can connect to. So we're going to go down and find the safe.microsoft SharePoint. So this web service definition is for the SharePoint Online connector. And the one below it, the SharePoint Online template, is for the SharePoint list reader and writer. And the reason there are two different web services here is because they use different APIs underneath. So the SharePoint Online connector is using the Microsoft Graph API to do all of the uploading, downloading, listing, etc., which is why it has a different web service definition. So if we look inside this web service definition, you can see some of the things that were mentioned on the slide. So we'll need a client ID, possibly a client secret, redirect URI, and then this is how FME is configured to authorize and authenticate with Microsoft. So as we have Azure Portal open, I'll show you how you can get those values. So you'll want to create a new registration. And you might find, perhaps if your organization is a little bit larger or you have dedicated people to manage Azure for your organization or Microsoft, you may not have access to this, in which case you'll need to tell whoever does manage your Azure or Microsoft applications exactly what you need from them. So I'm going to give this application a name, SharePoint, and then you will need to choose the tenancy. So if you set up a single tenant app, only people who belong to your organization will be able to use it, will be able to use this web service definition. So if once you've created the web service in FME, I tried to sign in with my personal OneDrive account or Outlook account to set up a web connection, that would fail. You would need to set up a multi-tenant application so anybody in any organizational directory could use your app registration. I'm going to leave this as single tenant. And for the moment, I'm going to leave the redirect URI blank and then create or register this application. So this will take you to the overview page, and you can see right away in front of us, we can see the client ID. So you can click copy that to your clipboard and then go and paste that into FME. We don't need a client secret because we're going to register this application on the authentication. We're going to set this up as a desktop platform. So because FME Desktop is a desktop application, we'll set it up as a desktop in Azure. And Microsoft doesn't trust desktop applications to keep a client secret secret. Because someone else could easily be logging onto your laptop, using it, using FME, they potentially have easier access to that secret. So it isn't really a secret. So if you try to send a client secret to Microsoft and you've registered it as in Azure as a desktop application, Microsoft will reject it. You'll see a 401 error in FME, and that's why. If you are setting up a web application, so something like FME Server, where the backend isn't accessible to everyone, the users only access it through a web UI, that can be trusted to keep a client secret and send it. In that case, you would set this up as a web and you would obtain a client secret. But for FME Desktop, we'll set this up as a desktop platform. You can see this redirect URI matches what is in FME right now. So I'm just going to check that box and press configure. If you had set it up as a web platform and you were doing this for FME Server, you could go to this page, create a new client secret, and then you get the value here. You would need to copy this, put this into the web service definition, and publish it to FME Server. And you would need to make sure that you're taking the value when you create the secret. If you try to come back tomorrow to get the value of the client secret, that will be sort of covered up with stars, so you can't see it for security. But for now, I'm just going to say that goes away from red, just put a space in there. Checking the optional box means that it won't send the client secret when it makes the request to authenticate with Microsoft. So the next thing we need to do, if you remember about the tenancy, we need to make sure that when FME is going to Microsoft, it has the right tenant ID in here. So you can get that again from this overview page and edit the authorization URL. And you're going to want to paste your tenant ID in here. So what you might find if it's the first time downloading the SharePoint Online connector to Workbench, when you edit and configure your web service, this part of the URL will say common. And that's okay if you're using a multi-tenant application or app registration. If you're using single tenant, you need to make sure you're putting the tenant ID in here. And again, with the retrieve token URL, you want to make sure that this is your tenant or directory ID. Press OK. The last thing you're going to need to do inside Azure portal is set up the API permissions. Because this app registration is going to be connecting to SharePoint, we need to add the permissions so that we're actually able to access SharePoint. So choose to add permissions, choose Microsoft Graph, because as I mentioned, the SharePoint Online connector uses the Graph API. Click Delegated, and then just to make it easier to find, you can search for sites at the top. If you want sites manage all and sites read write, and then add those permissions. If admin consent was required, you could check that box. I'm just going to leave it for now. But then this is all we need to set up our web service definition in FME. So we can apply that and then test it. So this will just bring up a little browser window. You can go and sign in to your account. And as long as you configured everything correctly, that should be successful. So now we can go and actually create a web connection on this page. Choose the web service that you just configured. In this case, it was this one. Call this webinar connection SharePoint. And again, you'll need to go and authenticate, sign in with the user you connect to SharePoint with, and press OK. And then if I had a SharePoint Online connected to Workbench, I should be able to use that web connection. And then, for example, if I was going to list, you can choose your action here. Because it knows what user I'm signed in as, it will return the sites that I have access to, and it will also return the document libraries that I have access to. So the web connection is working. Okay, so now that I've shown you how to set all of that up, a few tips and tricks, things to remember. The client secret does trip a lot of people up. So if you're registering it in Azure Portal as a desktop application, remember not to configure a client secret. And again, the tenancy is something else that throws a lot of people off. If it's multi-tenant, you can leave common in the auth URL. If it's single tenant, you need to make sure you're putting the directory or the tenant ID into your web service definition. So this kind of allows you, sets the foundation up to connect to any service, which Dara is going to show you an example of.
Great, thanks, Jen. So yeah, next we're going to take a look at connecting to Microsoft services using the Microsoft Graph API. Okay, so for anyone who might not know what the Microsoft Graph API is, it provides a unified programmable model that you can use to access a tremendous amount of data in Microsoft 365. So taking a look at the Graph Explorer, we can see that there are a lot of different options on queries that we can run. Some of which you can see here, like creating a team in Microsoft Teams or sending an email through Outlook. Some of these capabilities are already in transformers in FME, but if there is a service that you're missing, it may be possible to reach it using the HTTP caller and the Graph API. So if we wanted to create a team in FME using the HTTP caller, we could copy this request URL. And we want to just take note of the method here, which is post. And if we go over to FME, add a creator to the canvas and the caller. I'm going to paste the request URL into here, change the method to post. Now for the upload body, I'm going to go back to the Graph Explorer and just copy this. And paste it into here. And then we can change things like the architecture, or say the display name. So we can call this Microsoft Webinar. And then just change the description of the channel as well. Okay. And now I just want to use the authentication here. So I'm going to use that web connection that I set up for Microsoft Graph. So, and click OK. So now once I run this workspace, okay, so, and if we go over to Microsoft Teams, you can see we have a new team here called Microsoft Webinar. So just some things to take note of when you're using the examples from the Graph Explorer. In here, you can see the permissions that you'll need to perform these queries. So Jen kind of went into this when she was setting up the app in the Azure portal. So if I didn't have the correct permissions in here, I'd be able to see this consent button. So if I click onto one of these here, you can see this consent button here. I can also add those permissions in the Azure portal as well. So I'll pass it back to you again there, Jen.
Yep. Okay. So now that Darish kind of shown us how we can go and find different API calls, we can put those into FME with a HTTP caller. I can kind of go into how the Microsoft Teams connector was created. So this was something that was asked about on the sort of FME community, I think, quite a bit. People were looking for a way to work with Microsoft Teams. So the most obvious thing to do with Teams, like we already have a Slack connector which does this. So we kind of made the equivalent for Teams, which allows you to post a message to a channel. I was also trying to find out what else people wanted to do with Teams and sort of wrap this all up into one custom transformer connector. So you can also store files in Teams. So we added some of that functionality as well because the Microsoft Graph API supports it. So you can download the Microsoft Teams connector from FME Hub if you want to use it. But I'll kind of show you how I went about creating it. So the end goal of the Teams connector, as I mentioned, is to send a message in Microsoft Teams from FME. So this is the API call that we took from the Microsoft Graph documentation that it sends the message to Teams. And you can see as part of the URL, one of the things that we need is the team ID and the channel ID. But to use this sort of API call right away, I don't have the channel ID and I don't have the team ID. So I needed a way to get those. So from looking through the Graph Explorer and looking through the Microsoft Graph API documentation, I was able to figure out a series of API calls that would get me all of the information I needed so that I could post a message to Teams. And if you ever look inside the Microsoft Teams connector, this is what you'll see. So the green input is coming in from the custom transformer, depending on the parameters that someone chose. The first HTTP caller is just getting the information about Teams. So getting a list of all of the joined teams that the user that you've authenticated with has access to. That response is going to come back as JSON. So we have a JSON fragmenter connected to the HTTP caller just to extract the team ID that's returned from Microsoft and the team display name. The SharePoint Online connector was built by a proper Python developer, so it's a bit nicer. So as you saw earlier, when I went to choose a list, it gave me a sort of a list of the lists that I could choose. I'm not that sophisticated. So I'm extracting the team display name that's going to match what someone types in here. You can see that this is like a free text box. You would type it in. And once that comes out of the JSON fragmenter, the tester will make sure that it's using the right team ID based on the team display name. So once we've got the team ID and the team display name, we can then pass that into another HTTP caller, which is making another Graph API call to get the channels in that team. So we're basically doing the same thing again for channels, extracting the channel ID, the channel name. The tester is matching on the input that the user put inside the transformer. And then this is able to go to another HTTP caller, which will send that message in Teams. So we can go and actually have a look at this inside FME. So you can see on my canvas, I already have added the Microsoft Teams connector transformer. So this is a custom transformer. If you've never used one before, or if you've never looked inside of one before, you can right-click on the transformer and click Edit. And that will take you in and show you all of the transformers inside it. So you can see here, straight away from the input of the custom transformer, these are all the transformers that we saw on the slides. So just getting the team information, getting the channel information. And then after this, we have a test filter. So depending on what the user configured inside the Teams connector and which action they chose to do, will depend which way out of the test filter the feature goes. So if they wanted to post a message to a channel, that feature goes to this HTTP caller, which is the API call we saw earlier. We're uploading JSON to the API, which is the chat message that they want to send in Teams. And then just tidying this up before it goes back out to the custom transformer. And again, if someone wanted the SharePoint site information, there's a series of HTTP callers to be able to get all of that information. And the same with listing the team files again. So you can download this transformer, click Edit, go inside and have a look to see what API calls are being made if you want to. And as Dara showed with the authentication, every single one of these HTTP callers is using the Microsoft Teams web connection that we've got set up with the right permissions to be able to make all of these API calls. So a few tips and tricks if you want to build your own custom transformer or you want to connect to different API calls to interact with different services. Definitely read the documentation for the web service that you're connecting to. This is super helpful so you can see what other HTTP calls you need to make those in series, and even see the permissions that you need. Like Dara showed, the Microsoft Graph Explorer will show you, as will the documentation. If they have somewhere you can test the API calls out, like the Graph Explorer, this means you can make sure they're set up correctly in there before moving over to FME, if you're a little bit more comfortable doing that rather than using the HTTP caller. And just using custom transformers makes it as easy as possible for end users. If you had sent someone that sort of like Teams connector as it was before it got wrapped up, there's a lot of HTTP callers in series there. It might get confusing or be a bit easier to break. And it obviously means it's easier to share with other people. And definitely annotate or bookmark your work in FME for future reference. I'm getting better at this, but it definitely makes it easier if you need to go in and use it in the future, make edits or fix things, if you know exactly what is going on inside your custom transformer. So something else that was requested with FME and Microsoft Teams related was supporting adaptive cards. So adaptive cards are ways that sort of authors can describe their content as a JSON object. And then this will then get rendered natively inside a host application, in this case, Microsoft Teams, and it adapts to the look and feel of the host. So this was an example of some JSON that I created to make an adaptive card, which we can then send to Microsoft Teams. So if you're interested in doing this as well, it's kind of like how the Teams connector sends a message to Teams, but this looks a bit nicer and it has more functionality. So Microsoft has an app studio, which you can find online to kind of design your adaptive card. And then once you've built it, you can copy that JSON into a workspace or into a HTTP caller and send that to Teams via a webhook. So in this case, this scenario was taking job information from FME server. So this would be part of an automation. Perhaps when your automation has run, other workspaces have run, this will then send it to Teams as an adaptive card to let you know that your workspace or job on FME server has completed. So all of the JSON you saw in the other slide looks like this on the bottom right when it gets posted into Teams. So it looks a lot nicer. And the other thing it supports is buttons. So you can see the View Job Log button there. From within Teams, you can click that and it will take you to the FME server web UI and you can view your job log. So this is a much nicer way and a pretty easy way of sending nice messages to Teams. So if you're interested in a bit more information on that, definitely reach out, let me know, and we could probably put a community article together on this. And then lastly, as we're talking about Microsoft and the cloud, we should talk about the support for Azure. So we do have support for a lot of Azure services in FME. So just added a few screenshots here from the sort of integration format support page on our website. Just searching in for Azure brings up all of those services on the left-hand side, which we can connect to. And then again, we have transformers in FME, connected transformers that will interact with those services. So again, just typing Azure on the canvas, you can see a list of all of those transformers there. So if you're working with Azure in FME, it's quite easy to do so.
So just to summarize what we covered here today, so FME has a lot of support for Microsoft products and services, and you can see that there's a multitude of different ways of connecting to those services, either through the transformers or through the APIs. If there's a service that FME doesn't support, if they have an API, you should be able to connect to it. Some next steps that you can take. If you'd like to reach out to us via email, you can do so by emailing info@safe.com. You can download and test out FME 2022 with a free trial so that you can implement some of the workflows that we have run through here today, and then apply your own web connections and permissions in the workspace and run the workflows. We've also just compiled some resources to help you along with your FME journey. So the webinar that I mentioned earlier, and we also have some links here to help you get started with FME and web services, and also connecting FME to Microsoft Teams.
Awesome. Thanks, Dara. So check out our upcoming and on-demand webinars. We have a lot of great content coming. safe.com/webinars. As a thank you for you all joining us today, claim your community badge. Visit fme.ly/webinar badge, and today's code is on the screen there. And I will also drop that into the chat now. Our Peak of Data Integration 2022 UC. We're all really looking forward to this. It's coming up really quick, August 24th to 26th. And if you have yet to register, you can do so now. I'll drop that link in the chat. Share your feedback and experience with FME via a Gartner Peer Insight review. We'd really appreciate if you could contribute a review. I will share out that link as well. All right, and with that, it looks like we do have some time remaining for some Q&A here. So if you have yet to get your question in, definitely drop that into the questions tab on the bottom right there. Upvote any questions you saw that came in that look relevant to you as well, and we'll take a look at those now.
Okay, so I guess I was actually just about to type an answer to a question. So instead of doing that, I will just answer it here. So the question was asking, do the adaptive cards buttons just link to a URI? So the button in the adaptive card that was pointing to the FME server job log, that would have been created from the FME server parameters based on the job ID that had ran. So it'd just be an FME server URL. You would then have to go to sign into FME server, and then you would be able to see the job log, if that answers the question. Yeah, there was a few other questions as well about importing files directly into FME to be able to read them. So let me I've tried to explain what I've been doing. So maybe at this point, if I can share my screen, I can try and walk through what I've tried to write out in the answers to the questions. So if you can see Workbench now, this precipitation Excel file is actually coming from SharePoint directly. So if I'm adding a reader, you can see kind of proof that that's what I did here in the long URL for the dataset. In the drop-down next to dataset, you can select file from web. So because I've installed the SharePoint Online connector package, I have this option to browse SharePoint here. When I click on that, I'll be prompted to choose my site. And then I can choose the document library. And then inside here, I'll see all of the files inside that document library. So I just chose precipitation from here and then read that in. And that's how I got that feature type on my canvas. So I hope that's what that question was looking for. Otherwise, honestly, I don't actually use SharePoint actively. I just know how to connect to it. So if that's not quite what you're looking for, let us know and we can look into that a bit more.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know there was a couple other questions we addressed in the panel there already as well.
Yeah, there was a question about Okta as well, which I knew. I think we have a few customers using Okta for authentication. We personally don't use it, so I haven't been able to test this, but I think from seeing other customers use it, it might be when you authenticate in a browser, I think it gives you additional prompts, or maybe you authenticate another way, kind of like two-factor authentication. I'm not 100% sure on that, but if it does it through the browser window, then you should still be able to do the same prompts as if you were doing it through like Google Chrome or Edge or something. But if that is giving you issues, let us know and we can try and work on that.
Okay, any other questions there we may want to address?
Joanna asked one question about the best way to share web connections between users. So I just highlighted that you're able to export the web connection from within FME. If you go to Tools, FME Options, Web Connections, you can right-click on your web connection and choose the Export button, and you can choose whether to include or exclude credentials, and it'll be exported as an XML file. Hopefully that answers that question.
Right, and we'll see if we can get Dale on board here. I think he might have a thought or two to share as well. I just invited him to participate, so hopefully all goes well there and he's able to pop on stage shortly. All right, and in the meantime, maybe I'll just let everyone know that if you are able to share your feedback on the webinar today, I've posted a link in the chat there. It's just a quick Google form. Yeah, let us know what you thought. We love to hear any feedback, and it always helps us improve on our program. Okay, we'll just give Dale one last moment here. Oh, there we are. Perfect.
I didn't really have anything too profound to say other than just thanks everybody for tuning in, but also please, you know, as Jen said, we don't actually make use of a lot of these services ourselves at SAFE on a daily basis, and so it's a little bit like not on home turf. And so we do need your input and ideas on making our support for the Microsoft Cloud services ever better. And we do appreciate that a lot. So we use the phrase at SAFE, do we eat our own dog food? And in this case, we don't actually eat our dog food very much, but we realize that it might be very tasty dog food. So so please let us know what we could be doing better. Or we could add a little bit more salt and spice in there, let's put it that way.
All right, and with that, thank you so much to our team of presenters here this morning. Fantastic webinar, and thank you all for everyone tuning in this morning. We really appreciate you joining us, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.